You know, I've often said that I was raised by my mom and Disney movies. I've always loved fairy tales and always kind of imagined myself as maybe being one. Whenever I saw the underdog take on the big boss and win, that was always inspiring to me. And I always imagined that I could do that I would be such a hero someday. And I probably even got lost in kind of a fantasy world on occasion, imagining that maybe my deeds were greater than they were, and just kind of preparing myself for the moment when I would be called to act out such heroism. But as I began to learn and to grow, one of the things that I realized is that chances are we're not going to be called to be heroic in that sort of way. In a similar fashion, whenever I would hear stories of Christians who were giving their lives for Jesus Christ, I did the same sort of thing that I did with Disney movies, but now in a Christian key. I thought, certainly, that if I were asked to give my life for Jesus, I would do it. I think that I could die for Jesus. That's how I felt so often. And then I began to think, I'm probably not going to be called to give my life for Jesus. Chances are I'm not going to die for him, at least not in that sort of way. And so whenever I would interpret the Bible in certain ways that required me to forfeit my life for Jesus, to die for him in a sort of a martyrdom fashion, I realized that while I might be saying something true, certainly I would be required to do that if the occasion called for it, I realized that really was an interpretation that didn't touch my life. I'm not going to meet those circumstances. And so I had this interpretation of the Bible that, while true, never intersected or crossed over into my life. It didn't touch my life in any real sort of way. And so I began to remember a story that a professor of mine told on one occasion. Apparently he and his wife had gotten into it sometime, and I don't know what they were fighting about or what occasioned this particular interjection. But regardless, it ended with him pounding his fist on the table and saying, "Don't you understand? I would die for you." And his wife responded, "I don't want you to die for me. I want you to die a little every day." And that kind of brought it home to me. You see, it's unlikely that he would be called to give his life for his wife. But he is called every single day to die to himself in 1,000 little ways. In Luke 9:23, he says that if anyone would come after me, he must take up his cross daily and follow after me. You see, our dying for Christ should happen day by day. Yeah, we're likely not to be martyrs for Jesus, but we are called to be crucified with Christ every single day, to die in little sorts of ways. And when I began to think about it like that, I began to realize how maybe even non-existent my heroism was. I imagined myself fighting dragons and giving my life for Jesus in the Colosseum, but I so often complained whenever it came to getting a cup of water for my wife in the middle of the night. And yet, that is giving myself for Jesus Christ. Do you recall in Matthew chapter 25 where he talks about all these deeds that we do for the least of these? How that we visit those who are in prison and feed those who are hungry and bring a drink to those who are thirsty. And he says, as much as ye have done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. And so those are the occasions, the real occasions, the times when that sort of thing actually does touch my life. It actually does intersect my life. I am called daily to die to myself and to live for Jesus Christ whenever I live for my family, for my friends, whenever I endure the minor irritations that actually meet me, whereas dying in a coliseum would not. And so often I would fail. And I recalled Proverbs 24:10 that says, if you fail in the day of adversity, your strength indeed is small. Or maybe Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 5, where God said to Jeremiah, if you have run with the footmen and they have wearied you, how will you keep up with the horses? You see, all these little things, they wore me down really, really quickly. But in my own mind and in my own heart, I was ready to run with the horses. I was ready to die in the Colosseum, but I couldn't get a cup of water. You know, so often we think that being a Christian means great deeds, but rarely are we called to do such great deeds. Rather, we're called to do small deeds with great loves. With great love. That's perhaps one of the reasons that Sainte Thérèse de Lisieux, she's sometimes called the Little Flower, she's perhaps one of my favorite saints. She died very, very early of tuberculosis. But her life in the convent began early. She wanted to enter in the convent, if I recall, at age 14, but she was unable. I think they had to be maybe at least 16. Eventually, she did get a special dispensation from the church in order to enter the convent, I think maybe when she was 15. So she entered exceptionally early. But after that, unless I've got the story wrong, she never left the convent. And so she wouldn't have had occasion to give her life on the streets of Calcutta serving the poor, or maybe to give her life in the Colosseum. Rather, she stayed in the convent. She said her prayers. She did her duties. But if you read her autobiography, if you learn anything about her, you find that the small ways in which she showed patience to her fellow sisters were quite heroic. My favorite account probably is when she talks about being at prayer, and there was a particular sister whose clicking noise that she made as she prayed grated on her nerves so severely, and yet she endured it. And she called herself to pray for that sister and to bless her. And however she did it, I don't know, but the reading of that particular account was so intense. There was so much tension in the air. It really felt like this endurance of this minor irritation was an absolutely Olympic feat. For me, that was perhaps one of the most saintly things that I'd ever read, and it was a thing that I may actually be called to do. I am called to do on a regular basis, to endure minor irritations from friends and families and strangers. And so it's interesting that whereas we think about sainthood, we usually fantasize about great deeds, when in fact, just being home with our family, that might be the place where we're made into saints. Every day, you have the opportunity to show great love to your spouse, to your husband or to your wife, to your children, to your cousins, your aunts, your uncles, the strangers you meet on the street, those who cut you off in traffic, those who are less than kind to you in the grocery store. Those are the real things that confront Christians every single day. And so, if we would be saints, we don't have to be fed to the lions. We just have to love the ones that God has given us. And so then, if you would be a saint, maybe just start with loving your family. That may be the place where God is calling us to sainthood. And I think that's good news.